Welcome to the Jobs and Economic Development Committee. It's Wednesday, January 29th, about 12:33. We're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. We do have a quorum. Thank you, members, for being almost on time. I appreciate that. First up today, members, we have the state demographer. Ms. Brower, thank you for being here. And if you're ready, please state your name for the record and your title and get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Draheim. My name is Susan Brower. I'm the state demographer and I work in the Department of Administration. So I've been asked to provide an overview on the update and an update on the demographics of the labor force and labor force growth in Minnesota. So I will start today by reminding you, as many of you have already seen, that the labor force is growing very slowly in Minnesota right now. This decade it has been increasing, but not at all at the rate that it has been increasing in previous decades. Except for a brief slowdown after the pandemic. This is largely the result of population aging. Today, about 58% of the large baby boom generation has moved into retirement. There are still more retirements to come of people among that generation, but that has been kind of a massive movement out of the workforce. We also see birth rates that continue to fall in Minnesota. And these changes, both the aging of the population and the lower birth rates, they're very normal compared to other states in the US and other countries elsewhere. But historically, they're not the norm. And without the contribution of migration from other states or from other countries, we can expect this very, very slow growth to continue into the future. We'll look at the migration data in a moment, but first I just wanted to show you the most recent information on labor force participation and to provide that data in historical context. So we're looking at changes in labor force participation by age over the past 23 years, up through 2023, which is the most recent year for which we have detailed demographic data. And I want to point out a few different changes that have occurred over the long term. First of all, there is generally less labor force participation by teens than there was 23 years ago. In 2000, 61% of teenagers aged 16 to 19 participated in the labor force. That dropped to about 50% in 2010, and now it's kind of inched back up to 53% in 2023. After the pandemic, there have not been major changes in teenagers participating in the labor force. That rate has remained at about 53%. Another change that we've seen over the long term is that compared with 2010, 2023 saw higher labor force participation among people in their 20s. Labor force participation reached 90.5 for those between the ages of 25 and 29 in 2023. And finally, a third change that is quite obvious by this graph is that we have seen older workers increase their labor force participation into the older ages. In 2010, 55% of adults aged 60 to 64 participated in the labor force. Today, that number is 66%. Now, I'll remind you that this is over almost 25 years that we're looking at these changes here, that year by year these changes are incremental, maybe a percentage point, maybe a half a percentage point. I'm sharing this with you to demonstrate that while there have been changes over decades, generally labor force participation across the life course is very stable, even amid very different economic contexts. For those you can see in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, labor force participation has remained almost the same throughout, which suggests perhaps that a ceiling may have been reached among that group, despite the availability of jobs today and the demand for workers. Changes in labor force participation has contributed more to older adults and fewer teens participating in the labor force over the long term. So in the shorter term, over the past 3 years, there's just been a few very small changes, in particular people who are 20 to 24. There was a bit of an increase in labor force participation. But generally what we're seeing is this picture of stability over time. The changes that we have seen have been limited to the youngest and the oldest workers, suggesting that it's more of a transition into the workforce that's being sped up, or a transition out of the workforce that's been slowed as well. Or that's been slowed rather than sped up. I want to look now to people who are not in the workforce. We've looked at this in past iterations when I've been before this committee, but just to give you a sense of the number of people who are not in the workforce and kind of what their situation is. There are about 2.9 people of typical working age in Minnesota who are not in the workforce, and we're looking at age groups here of that group. You can see that there are about 600.
I'm sorry, you said it was 2.9? Can you, I missed that part, sorry.
Yes, Mr. Chair, there were 2.9 million of 16 to 64. So that's not including those who are over the age of 65. And that's in this particular data set that come from the 2023 American Community Survey. So there are more recent data from DEED. One moment, please. $3.1 million, that's of all ages, as of December 2024 is the most recent total labor force number. I'm showing you a lagged number because we have more information about the characteristics of people if we lag it back to 2023. So that's why we're looking at these rather than the December numbers. We don't have the same kind of full characteristics. So of the 634,000 people who are not in the workforce, about 184,000 were in high school or post-secondary school. That's shown in the darkest blue on these bars. You can see that concentrated, of course, among the teenagers, those in their early 20s. About 67,000 were estimated to have retired before the age of 65, and the remaining 384,000 people that you see in that lighter color are people that have other caregiving responsibilities. They may have disabilities or health issues. It's kind of the other groups that are not included by retirements or by attending school.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question real
Please.
quick? And members, if
Mr.
anybody
Chair.
else has questions, let me know. So just to unpack that, who is not in the labor force thing. So we have 3.1, or let's just say 3 million approximately in the labor force. And that's that 16 to 64 age group, correct? Or is that all the way out to 80?
The 3.1 would be the 16 plus, so it would be everyone who is of working age, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
And then I think historically when we talk K-12, there's what, about 900,000 kids in that area? So if we just say there's 1 million under 16, would that be about right? Just rough numbers, just trying to understand.
Under the
it.
age of 16. There's about 70,000 in each cohort, 60 to 70,000 in each
grade
year.
level?
Yeah, yeah.
From birth on?
Yeah.
60 to 70
Yeah.
per year?
And about
I'm just trying to get to the 5.7 million Minnesotans.
Oh.
Trying to
Yes.
understand where that is.
Where that fits in.
So, you're saying about a little better than half are participating in the workforce.
The total percentage?
Yeah,
Oh, that's 60, for the 16.
I'm just trying to get the age
Yeah,
breakdown.
it's about 67, 68% for the 16 plus population that are participating in the workforce.
But you don't have a high end, 68.2 or whatever it's at, I think is, so, and you take that number, I'm trying to understand the math.
Okay.
So when you calculate that, do you take it times everybody in Minnesota? So the 5.7 million. So if I took 5.7 million times 68.2% or whatever the number is today, that would be the number of people that are participating in our workforce. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, no. The labor force participation rate is only of those who are 16 and above. So the 67.8% in December was only of people who were
So if
16 and above.
Sure, yeah, so what I was trying to get at is if we took 1 million people, which I think is probably pretty close, that are under 16,
Take them out.
take them out of the equation, instead of 5.7, I'd have 4.7 million people. You know what I'm saying? So if I had 4.7 and I took that times your 68 point whatever it is this month, times the 4.7 million people, would that be a rough estimate of the workforce that we have available that are participating in the workforce?
Yeah, that's the calculation, is to take the
That's pretty
remaining
simple, right?
16 plus times 67.8,
Okay,
yes.
okay, perfect, thank you. Sarah Pa, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Chair Graham. Kind of a little bit of what the chair is doing is just kind of understanding how all the numbers fit into our population. When you talk about like people in the labor force, do you include like part-time workers, seasonal workers, maybe those stay-at-home moms or dads who are entrepreneurs part-time? How does that count into when you talk about the labor force?
Ms. Brown?
Mr. Chair, Senator Fa, in this particular definition that we're looking at here, it's anyone who's participating either part-time, full-time, whether they're self-employed or not. It is self-identified by a survey, so it's people who are responding to a survey say, yes, I worked some amount in a reference week.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank
Follow?
you. No, that's good.
Anybody else? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my point with showing you the labor force participation rate is that there is a little bit of wiggle room there in terms of bringing more people into the labor force, but there really hasn't been a lot of movement in other than at the very youngest ages and at the oldest ages. And so if we are to continue to see our workforce grow into the future, it's likely going to have to rely on migration from outside of Minnesota's borders. And so I want to show you what historically the migration picture has looked like for Minnesota, so you can kind of understand what would need to change or what would need to stay the same in order for the workforce to continue to grow. So we're looking here at the historical trend up through 2024 of how many people are added to the state each year due to either domestic migration, that's all the movement around the U.S. into and out of Minnesota. And we're also looking, that's the gray bars. The blue bars are showing you the number of people who are added to the state due to international migration. So all the people who left the U.S. From Minnesota compared to all the people who come to Minnesota from outside of the U.S. in a given year. And typically, I'll start just with the domestic migration. Typically, we see a small net outflow of people to other states. That's a trend that I've shared with this committee and many other people in the past. This is part of being in the Midwest. It's very typical for the Midwest to see a Midwestern state to see a small net outflow of people. And that has historically been true for Minnesota as well, although you can see there's a couple years where we registered positive migration. Now, about 100,000 people leave the state each year, and just under 100,000 come into the state each year. So these numbers are kind of hiding the fact that there's much more movement than there actually is. With all that movement, what tends to be the case, though, is that stability of a net loss year after year after year. In contrast, when we look at international migration, it tends to be a source of growth for the state. And you can see in the last few years, we've seen even more international immigration than we've seen in the past. The Census Bureau recently updated its methodology and actually captured more growth than it had been in the past. So we're both seeing more immigration and data that better captures that migration as well. But you can see from the black line, that's just adding the two bars together, that on net, more people move to Minnesota than move away, but most of that comes from international immigration. Actually, all of it in most years comes from international immigration.
Ms. Brower, on that 22, any explanation on why such a large outlier on that year of population loss, domestic?
Mr. Chair, yes. This was still disruptions due to the pandemic, particularly among college-age students who either chose to take a gap year, stayed at home and took classes remotely. This was a disruption that happened nationally, that there was kind of a temporary change in the regular migration patterns, and mostly among college students is where those patterns changed.
Thank you. I think Senator Nelson has a question. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was along the lines of the chair's question, and I'll just kind of add to that. So it's interesting to see, there's two trends that look to be trends. One trend is that we have, as you mentioned, more people leaving our state, more domestic, I guess you'd call that domestic Minnesotans, I'm not sure, but would be leaving our state. But on the other hand, the trend shows that we have an increasing number of internationals who come to settle in our state. We welcome everyone in our state, but my question is, why is that typical? Why is it that, and is anyone looking into this? I guess this is not a question I'd expect you to answer unless somebody is already looking into this. I would be interested to know if other states are seeing kind of those same trends. People determined to, I don't know if you'd say natives or born in the state, or I don't know how you define that, but are leaving the state, but influxes of people from international are coming to the state. Are we seeing other states who are having kind of that same trend? And if it's not a normal trend, if it's like an anomaly for Minnesota, then I'd want to know, are there some reasons for that, and what might that be?
Ms. Brower?
Mr. Chair, Senator Nelson, it's not unusual, this pattern, for a Midwestern state, both to have people leaving the state, those domestic losses, and to have much more growth coming from international immigration. I'd say because of our healthy economy here in Minnesota, and because we have a sizable metropolitan area, we have a greater kind of pull factor into our kind of economies than maybe a smaller state, say, North Dakota, or, another Midwestern state that doesn't have the same size of a large metro area. So I'd say that's a pretty big pull for international immigrants. But to see for a Midwestern state to be losing people domestically and gaining people internationally is not unusual. It does vary by region of the U.S. though, that pattern.
Go ahead,
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Nelson.
Chair, and thank you. And so, and it's interesting that you said by the Midwestern states. And so, what is special about those Midwestern states, about us? Is it our climate, our physical climate? Is it our tax climate? What is it that? So if you can maybe just elaborate a little bit on that. What I'm really interested in is how are we different? I understand the Midwest. We are the Midwest. But how are we different from other Midwestern states as far as this pattern of migration, in-migration or out-migration? And you kind of alluded to part of it because of our metropolitan areas. But are there other things too? Is there anything else that would be important for us to know in that regard?
Ms. Brower?
Mr. Chair, Senator Nelson, I guess we could take Illinois as an example, and it's had kind of a massive loss of people compared to Minnesota domestically in recent years. Its economy has not been as strong. It's had other kind of issues that have moved, that have kind of pushed people out of the state, I would say. And so I'd say, if you compare us to Chicago, we're holding on to our residents. We're much stickier than than Illinois has been in the last few years. So that's just one example of how we differ, but I would say if we're thinking about broadly, the Midwest for decades has been not a net importer or not been kind of a destination spot over and above other places. We've seen most of that migration center around the southwestern United States and the southern United States. Climate certainly plays a factor. Size of places play a factor in terms of the pull, but we are very typical of what a Midwestern or even Northeastern state would look like in terms of our patterns.
Thank you. Senator Champion has a question also.
Ms. Brower, thank you, first of all, for being here. As usual, you're giving us so much to think about. And just so that I'm looking at this correctly, I am interested in the line of discussion around young people are the main drivers of migration patterns, and I see that to be true. And I know that Senator Nelson was trying to figure out who was moving and what, and I think what she was trying to get to was the fact that there's been a narrative that says that retired Minnesotans, or those who are a little more seasoned, I don't want to say older, end up finding themselves moving out of Minnesota because of the tax climate and some of the other things. Is that true, first of all, and based on what you know? And secondly, as I look at it, when I look at 60 to 64 and 65 to 69, it seems like there's some migration, but nowhere near the migration when you think in terms of folks who are younger. So can you just speak to that, and whether these numbers also account for people who are what we call snowbirds?
Go ahead,
Mr.
Ms.
Chair, Co-Chair Champion. Yeah, so we're looking here just at the numbers that I think you've seen before, but you can see just how much more migration happens among people who are in their teens and in their 20s. This is typical everywhere. This is not a Minnesota phenomenon. People are just more mobile when they don't have kids in school systems and they don't have mortgages, and it's just very typical age in your life when you expect to perhaps move to another state. In this particular graphic, you can see where the losses are occurring, and losses do occur both in those older ages, Senator Champion, like the snowbirds. You didn't say older ages, but I will. The snowbirds, if you see the migration from Minnesota, so people moving away are in the gray bars and people moving to Minnesota are in the blue bars. Wherever there's a gap between those two bars, that's where there's a loss of people. The largest losses that we see of any age group are of people in their teens, in their early 20s, but we do see losses at the older ages, the retirement ages, the snowbird years as well. But we do see in migration at all ages. So it's not a one-way movement by any means at any age. There's people moving in and moving out in every year, but it's concentrated in most years in those young teens to early 20s.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chairs. A couple of observations as I look at this, right? One is to understand why our young people are leaving. It's easy to say that they're going off to college, and that begs the question, why aren't Minnesota institutions keeping kids here? I've got I think I've shared with both of you that, my daughter was applying to physical therapy school. She got put on a wait list by Minnesota, and she was accepted by the University of Texas. Now we have a bright young physical therapist in Austin, Texas, instead of Austin, Minnesota. Why are these young professionals leaving? And then I think it's also interesting, if we remember back to 2013 when we added the fourth income tax level, that we saw a loss of wealth. Those older Minnesotans moving away, they're the ones that had the taxable assets, I think within I think within 2 years, we had seen about $1.5 billion of taxable assets move out of the state. I think within 5 years, Senator Nelson, you probably remember this better than I do, it was probably closer to 3 or 4 billion had moved out of the state. And so we can look at the raw numbers, but that doesn't always talk about what the true impact is to the state and the state's economic health. We want those taxable assets to stay in the state. We want to make sure that we've got job opportunities and economic and educational opportunities for these kids to stay. And I'm worried that we're missing on both sides of that equation. And I don't know, Ms. Brower, if you've got any thoughts on that as we look at just not just the raw numbers, but maybe some of what's behind the numbers as well.
Ms. Brower.
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, I'd agree with you that all those things are concerns and those things are behind the numbers. In particular, I wonder about the opportunity structure for post-secondary school for young people. Just the example that you gave of your daughter, the opportunities that are in front of them at the time, where they accepted, where are they given aid. I think those things are important pieces to the puzzle. I don't have an answer to say specifically here's how it's happening, the big picture, but I'd say that you've certainly hit the nail on the head in terms of pointing to those issues.
Senator Pratt.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, I've talked to a number of employers who find it hard to attract young professionals here because of our tax rate. And might be why some of these young professionals are leaving as well. It costs us more because of the weather, because of the tax rate, because of, you know, a whole host of things to bring young professionals in. And so I think it's the schooling might be part of it, but I don't think that's all of it, right? I mean, that's a portion of it. But when you start looking at the 25 to 29 bucket, they're out of school and they're starting their careers and they're starting to build their careers elsewhere. I think we need to really look at why and where the self-inflicted wounds that the state has exist, and making sure that we have an economy that has opportunity at all ranges. And I, you know, one of the concerns I've had is that we've been building jobs in the low-income ranges, but we haven't really built careers that will sustain somebody through their entire life. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a very important discussion, and I want to thank you for bringing the information for us to really look at, digest. And there are a lot of questions. I think there's uniform agreement that we all want more people to stay in Minnesota that are here, and we want more people to choose to come to this state and stay here. And so as we delve into this information, it is important to look at all these different factors and try and think how can we change some of those outcomes. And a couple things came to my mind in our discussion. And it's been a few years since I've been on higher ed, but what I would say is one of the telling statistics is that a vast majority of students end up getting their first job in the state from which they graduate. So where they graduate from for their training, whether it's college or workforce training, whatever it is, they stay right in that state. And so I do think it's important that we make sure that our higher education institutions, not just our higher education institutions, but we have a whole new way of job training today, and all the different elements and all the different ways that employers can participate in workforce development and online training, all those things. We need to make sure that we are a hot spot for that, and that we have more of our graduating Minnesota high school seniors stay here for their future career training. And there's a lot of improvement I think we can make in that area, which will be helpful in keeping those young people here. But I also don't want to lose sight of the fact, we kind of talked about it briefly, both Senator Pratt and Senator Champion, I believe, and the chair as well, that, you know, we do have to be very cognizant of the fact that we have a job climate, both for Minnesotans to stay here, and also for our employers who we want to recruit new employers to our state. We want our employers to expand in this state. And that's where we get into some of those very most important issues about what is our job climate. And I know both chairs are very interested in that. That is really the focus of this committee. And we cannot deny the fact that jobs, while we love every job that comes here and every new company, there are faster growing parts of this nation as far as new jobs, new employers, new businesses coming to those states. Now, some things we don't have any control over the climate as far as that we are a Midwestern state and a northern state, and we can have very harsh winters. Maybe not today and tomorrow, but believe me, we all have experienced them. And maybe some people don't want to do that, but there are things in our control. We can control our job climate. We can control our tax climate. And you can look at any of the indices, tax indices. There's lots of different things to compare. And on many of them, we are one of the least friendly states to employers or employees, and one of the highest tax states. I think we have to just acknowledge that. And I'll stop right there, but I would say those are all factors that I think this report should bring to us. And all of us serve in the full Senate where we see all of these things, and I think we just need to keep this in mind, that we want to make our state a growing state. We do not want to become a cold northwestern Minnesota state where people are leaving. We need to make this a climate where more people want to stay and come. I think we can do that.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Great comments. Ms. Brower, do you want to continue on?
Mr. Chair, yes. Just briefly, in response to the reasons why people move typically is because of jobs, because of family, and because of housing. We haven't brought up housing yet. And so I just wanted to point to kind of those as top reasons. Tax reasons tend not to come in the very top reasons of why people move when surveyed. This is a national survey that I'm referring to now. And the academic research on tax migration is mixed. Little is known for the full population, whether tax migration drives it. But there is evidence that for the very wealthy, millionaires and above, and for people who are kind of in unique situations like inventors who can move anywhere, that taxes do have an impact on migration. So I think just to kind of scale the reasons for why people tend to move, family and housing are up there as well. And for some people, tax migration is an issue.
Add one thing to that, Mr. Chair, just to kind of close up that discussion. It is a very important discussion. But I would also add that to that very same issue, though, we also have to look at the employer side and how many employers are expanding here, how many are growing here, how many new are we attracting to this state. And that's where we really get into the uncompetitive tax situations. We see the expansion of jobs in many other states that we're not seeing in Minnesota, and those are the things that I think we need to make sure that we look at as we go forward.
Thank you, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Nelson. That's an important distinction. Thank you. Okay, so I want to scale what we've been looking at, the migration, the movement of people in and out of the state, to the overall labor force growth. And so what we were looking at earlier was all people when we looked at the number, the loss of people and the gain in terms of international residents. We were looking at people who are children, who are students. Now we're just looking at an estimate of people who are actually working. To try to kind of scale that closer, to labor force change and then to job vacancies. So you can see that about 3,000 people each year who are workers move out of the state, well, not move out, on net are lost to the state of Minnesota. And we gained in the most recent period about 14,000 workers from abroad. Now, when I brought these numbers last year, that estimate was about 7,000, about half of that. So the increase has really come in the last year in terms of international migration and the contribution to labor force growth. This is an estimate, the labor force change that we're looking at there is 29,000 for an average from 22 to 2023. But if we're really to scale that a little bit closer to the 2024 time period, it's almost spot on with the amount of growth that the labor force experienced was about equal to the number of international workers that were added to the state. So I just can't underscore enough the contribution that international immigration has already made to the growth of the workforce, in particular in some industries like the healthcare support industries is something that the Federal Reserve Bank has pointed out recently. Now, while international immigration has really contributed to labor force growth, there's still a large number of job vacancies. As we well know, the demand is still really there. So what do these numbers mean to Minnesota? We're likely to see ongoing labor force shortages if the economy remains strong, if jobs continue to be added, because we're not going to see probably that level of growth unless we see a major turn around in immigration or migration. Under conditions where there's a labor force shortage, as we've already seen, there's a different dynamic between employers and employees. People have more choices. They can decide that they want to work elsewhere. There's typically upward pressure on wages that we would continue to expect to see. And there's also a slowdown in economic growth that often comes with slower labor force growth. That's been shown again and again in other places. And finally, as you are well aware, and as Senator Pratt and Senator Nelson brought up already, there are some things that policymakers and leaders begin to focus on and tend to focus on under these conditions of shortage, that it's important to support jobs that are essential, that are central to well-being, and those that have good wage growth trajectories or pathways. I think that really is something that comes to the fore when we're experiencing these labor force shortages, because there's not a surplus of people, and there isn't likely to be at any time soon. And so the focus on good jobs and jobs that help people support their families becomes much more pressing. Finally, I'd like to turn to a brief overview of the racial composition of Minnesota's workforce. Today, 23% of the state's labor force is made up of workers of color. That increase has been steady. It's been about a 0.5 percentage point increase per year, and the state's workforce will continue to become more racially and culturally diverse in the future. This will happen regardless of what happens with international immigration, and that's because the oldest workers who are retiring tend to be white, non-Hispanic, and the youngest workers who are coming in are much more likely to be more racially and culturally diverse. Over the past 13 years, we have seen a narrowing of some of the racial gaps in economic well-being. We're looking here at the unemployment rate by race over time. We've seen that the gap between white workers in Minnesota and workers of color has narrowed somewhat. In 2010, after the Great Recession, 20% of Black and Native workers in Minnesota were unemployed, and over 10% of Latina and Asian workers were unemployed. Today, those percentages are much lower for workers of color, and the decline has been quite rapid. Today, about 5.5% of Black or African American workers are unemployed, 4.2% of Latino workers, 2.9% of Asian, and 11.2% of Native workers, a percentage that has dropped but still remains very high. So while these gaps in unemployment remain today, they haven't gone away. They have narrowed considerably over the past several years. But when there is an economic downturn, we can see that workers of color tend to be the most susceptible to the impacts of those downturns. You can see the unemployment rate after the pandemic for workers of color really increased considerably, and again has come down since the recovery from the pandemic.
Senator Nelson.
I think, just one brief question. This is a great trend. I have one question for you, though. I noticed there's a blank spot in all, and I'm guessing that's a year, perhaps, a particular year around the pandemic. Can you just identify what year is not being recorded?
Ms. Brower.
Chair Draheim, Senator Nelson, that's 2020, where the data collection in the census was so bad that we don't report it. Just because the response rate was so bad because of the disruptions due to the pandemic.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Similarly, gaps remain in earnings between workers of color and white workers in Minnesota. These are the latest data from the American Community Survey for full-time year-round workers. We've seen a gradual increase in earnings for some workers of color over time in the past few years, for Black or African-American workers, for Latino men and women, for Asian and Native or Indigenous workers, the increase has been more flat. So there's more to be done to ensure that all Minnesota workers have the same opportunities for economic stability. You can see the gaps remain here, but there's still hope that these racial disparities are not, haven't been intractable, that there has been movement over the last decade or so.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to speak a little bit on this part here. You know, the income level are quite high for Asian as a whole, and I think Ms. Brown probably know this, but I just want our members to be aware that when you put Asian American as a whole, the income earning is quite high, but if you break down into Southeast Asian and East Asian, there's a disparity there. Southeast Asian arrive here as refugees and versus economic or education opportunity. So I just want members to be aware of that, even though they put us in the same silo as Asian American, which is role model for success. Although we are breaking down, I think Southeast Asian are on the same pool, or even at the lower earning, at the same as African American and Native Americans. I'm gonna throw a question, since have the mic now, I'm gonna throw a little question earlier about the international migration to our state. On page number 5, Ms. Brown can explain whether those international migration, are they due to political asylum, or they're in economic and educational opportunity migration to our state. Do we have an understanding of that breakdown?
Mr. Chair, Senator Hodge, thank you for bringing up the differences between groups. You're absolutely correct. We have a report called The Economic Status of Minnesotans that I sometimes share that shows exactly that breakdown in full-time earnings by different cultural groups or detailed racial groups that I would be happy to share with the committee to show just what those differences are within the group. And it's an important distinction. So thank you for bringing that up.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair.
Yep.
The increase that we have seen in the past few years in international immigration is likely due to the increase in unauthorized or undocumented immigration at the southern border. And so it is people seeking asylum who remain in undocumented status while they're going through the court system. Now, the way that the Census Bureau estimates these is they have a number for the whole of the U.S. and distribute them to states based on the amount of movement around the U.S. So this is an estimate that may change in future iterations of the data, but it's really reflecting that increase in international immigration from the southern border. That's my understanding of these data.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bauer. If I may just add one thing to clarify myself earlier, when I put in a silo of Asian American and Southeast Asian, just so that members are aware, Southeast Asian will break down into people from Laos, Vietnamese, Karen, Hmong, Bhutanese, Cambodians, and such. And the migration of these folks, including myself and Senator Pa, came to this country with nothing, whereas other immigrant may come with saving behind. So that is a new start for the Southeast Asian, and I'm sure for other refugee community as well, like our Somali community and Oromo. So just thought I'd make a point here. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Senator. Very interesting. And if you could share that cultural survey with the committee or send it to Tom. I love volunteering, Tom. And he could get it out to all of us, that would be wonderful. And also that survey on the housing that you referred earlier.
Mr. Chair, on the reasons for moving?
Yes,
Yes.
correct. Thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely. Thank you.
Please continue.
Chair Draheim, that's all I've prepared for today. I'm happy to take more questions if you have them.
Well, members, any further questions, Senator Powell?
I want to first, thank you, Chair. I want to first say thank you so much. I always look forward to these types of information because it kind of gives us a good landscape of where we're at here in Minnesota. As I'm thinking about the job vacancies, the labor force that we still need injected into our economy and just our state here, I'm thinking about the 384,000 people that you identified before that's not in the labor force. And I'm trying to think, what are some barriers or challenges or things that we can do to move the people that are in that working age but are not in the labor force? And what could be things that we can do to move them from that into the labor force? And I know some of it's probably due to constraints like you have elders you have to take care of, or you have young children you have to take care of. But I'm sure that there are other things, like, for an example, the proper skills needed to get into the labor force again, or trainings or education. And so what are some of your thoughts when we think about, one, the labor shortage we have, two, the people who are not in the labor force, and what can we do?
Ms. Brower?
Mr. Chair, Senator Fa, looking at the stability of how there hasn't been much growth in labor force participation in the past few years, despite the fact that there have been so many job opportunities, it seems to me that we have reached some kind of a ceiling. A ceiling's theoretical, but generally that we have really pulled as many people in as we possibly could, given the current context, training opportunities, wages. And so I think if we are to consider kind of pulling any more people in, I mean, the things that people are already considering are the things that are going to reduce the cost of moving into the workforce. So whether it's reducing the cost or increasing the availability of childcare, providing more training opportunities so that the wages that someone might be able to earn if they were to enter makes sense for making the trade-off between caring for children, caring for older adults. I think that's where we're at today, that most of the people who would like to have a job and have been trained to a level or to a wage that makes sense for them to be in the labor force, those folks are already in the labor force. And now who remains not in the labor force are either people who cannot work for maybe health reasons, or people who choose not to work because the calculus doesn't make sense, or people who just don't want to work because they have the ability not to, if that's a choice available to them. It's probably not many of those, but they are out there.
Follow-up, or you?
Just a statement.
Okay.
Chair, and thank you for your answer. Chair Champion, Chair Draheim, and committee members, this is something I'm really interested in as we continue our committee work, is just how do we help our Minnesotans who do want to be in the labor force, who want to work but maybe have challenges to do so. And I'm hoping that we can deal with some of those as we are in this committee. I know from my own experience, or just from my own constituents, some of the barriers to being in the labor force is childcare. Some of it is elder care. Some of it is the, really how strict the work environment is. Things have improved since COVID, where there's been opportunities for remote work, telework, but previous to that, it was very rarely used. And oftentimes, when you're maybe a single-parent household, where you have children, and it's hard to get time off from work, or if you miss a certain amount of work, then now your job's at jeopardy, and your family's definitely more important than your job. So as we think about just Minnesotans and what we need to do to make sure that they can do what they need to do to take care of their families, that we look at some of these things as, and then also, of course, how can we get people into the labor force that currently aren't in the labor force to fill in those shortages? Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Champion.
One question for you, Dr. Brower. When I look at what you have on page 11 and how you outline the disparities in earnings remain across race and gender, and then I look at Black or African American, and then I also heard Senator Herb as he talked about Asian, do you think there's a danger or is there a benefit to disaggregating the data so that we have a better sense of who in those, in that diaspora is really doing well and those who are not doing so well?
So if I could just interject before you answer, I've always thought we should break it up by region or county or congressional district instead of the categories you have here, which is mainly by color. And, you know, I think that would enable us to better have the resources in the right location. Because it's pretty hard for a lot of the programs we support here, which are good programs, for people, you know, 150 miles away. So, but please, if you could interject my thought to Chair Champion's comment. Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Mr. Chair, I agree both in disaggregating by geography and by race or ethnicity, that it gives us better insights. And I'm regretting that I didn't bring those numbers today. I'm happy to provide them. I think that it's really important to understand, as you're developing your plans, to really understand who the population is, what barriers they're facing, and sometimes you can do that by looking at either detailed racial or cultural groups and detailed geographies. We have data on both of those things that I'm happy to share, and will do so as a follow-up.
Chair Champion?
And let me just say, that would be great, because from my vantage point, it's the difference between taking a surgical approach to something as opposed to just a hammer approach, right? And I think both are appropriate at different times, but when you're really trying to say, okay, here's the place or space where I'm trying to make sure that we are providing support for those who are sitting on the sideline or standing on the sideline that may be in northern Minnesota or maybe in North Minneapolis or even Brooklyn Center or Brooklyn Park. It would just give us that information so we know, like for an example, in Black or African American, I'm sure Black also includes, you know, Africans from, you know, Somali and other great places, right? But also we're missing, what about, you know, African Americans who are descendants of slaves, right? And how do they fit into that equation? Because sometimes you can think the whole group is doing better when in fact it's only a certain portion of that group, as I know is true in the Asian diaspora when you think in terms of Chinese versus, you know, Japanese and so on and so forth.
Thank
So
you.
that's more of a statement. Thank you, Dr. Brower.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions, members? So once again, thank you for coming, and appreciate it every year when the demographers come. Is one of my favorite parts. So thank you. And as we have, any closing comments before we have Deed come up?
Just thank you for having me. And we're here as a resource if you get into your work and find that you need more detailed data that you don't know where to find, that's what we're here for. So please do follow up with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now if we could have Deed come up, whoever on the team is going to speak. Do we need another chair, maybe, Pages, up at the,
Well, if we could get one though, Evan,
we can,
let's get one if we can.
they're bringing another chair. You'll have to share microphones, though. Commissioner, good to see you again.
You as well, Chairman.
And thank you for the meeting the other day. I thought it was a very, very good meeting. So thank you for taking time out of your guys' schedule to meet. So please introduce yourselves for the record, and whoever's starting, please start.
Great. Thanks, Chair Draheim. Thank you, Chair Champion and members of the committee. I'm Matt Verlick, Commissioner at the Department of Employment and Economic Development, and very glad to be with you all. Chair Draheim, I agree with you that the Demographer presentation is always one of the best, and it's one of your favorites, and we hope that Deed will be as well. So when it comes to a Deed update, I wanted to start out with a little context before you then hear from two deputy commissioners, and then with Deputy Commissioner McKinnon not being available today, our Government Relations Director, Devin Bowdry, is going to speak in his place. I will also say a little bit about the economic development portfolio that Kevin would normally cover, former temporary commissioner, Kevin McKinnon. At the very top, we start out with a little bit of demographic information, which harkens back to the great presentation we just heard from Dr. Brower, namely that our overall population, if you take all those numbers into consideration, grew at 0.7% in 2024, ranking us 27th nationally, kind of in the middle of the pack. And one thing that I really keyed in on from the presentation we just heard was when it comes to that matter of domestic migration, setting aside for a moment the high international migration we had last year, the domestic migration number, the net loss was quite small last year compared to that somewhat anomalous year of 2022. So we do take that as a good sign. And I don't know how much we have of it here in our presentation, but this is also the moment in which the Explore Minnesota for Business dollars that you all allocated with the governor's support are being deployed out in the world. And so we're hopeful that that will have a positive influence on some of those numbers as well. Moving on to the next bullet, looking at poverty levels, we rank quite well there, third lowest at 9.3%, although of course we always want to be reducing that further. And on educational attainment, 13th in median household income. As you all just discussed, to some extent, the labor force has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. And so we continue to see that as a very important responsibility of our agency, along with others across state government, along with so many of our partners, including some of whom are here in the room with us today. On the next slide, you can see we do continue to see significant strength in the Minnesota economy at this point. We are pleased to be the agency that gets to collect and release data on the state of the labor market on a monthly basis and continue to get good coverage on those things. And pleased to note that we've had now 6 straight months in a row of net job growth. We, of course, do see some layoffs and we see some business expansions. And what it adds up to on net is that 6 straight months of growth. And then if you look at the last 12-month period, we always do this on a rolling basis, we've had 10 out of 12 months with that net growth, which is a good thing. Overall, that 3 million figure of jobs, which is the highest it's ever been. Unemployment rate quite low at 3.3%, continues to be significantly less than the national average, which is something to be proud of, but also does present that challenge for employers that are trying to find people. As you also just discussed, we do continue to see some persistent income and employment disparities. Very pleased to see the progress that has been made there, but as we've discussed before at this table with all of you, reducing disparities in unemployment is just the first step. Then you also have to look at wages, then you also have to look at wealth. And so there's certainly a lot more to be done, and we are pleased at the agency that you have given us resources to make some strategic efforts to help those who need it most. Labor force participation, still very high, 67.8% compared to the national figure of 62.5. So that is a topic that, every state is wrestling with. I think this was touched on a little bit in your previous discussion, but we are bumping up against that theoretical ceiling, as Dr. Brower mentioned, and it's partly related to an aging population in Minnesota. She pointed out that the way the math works on that figure is it is the percentage of the 16 and up population who are working and who are not incarcerated and who are available to work. But as we have more of our Minnesota population getting into the older age cohort, when some people choose to retire, then that makes it harder for us to keep that participation rate high. And it also points to the importance of attracting Minnesotans, retaining Minnesotans, and helping young Minnesotans find career paths that are satisfying to them. And so again, to repeat at the bottom, labor force continues to be a challenge and one that we hear from employers across the state. Moving on to the state of business, and then eventually we'll get into the economic development portfolio that Devin will cover. But like to point out for context that we look at the annual rankings by CNBC of business environments. Last year we were 5th, this year 6th. I also know that according to U.S. News and World Report, they say we are 4th, so those are good places to be. We note that we are home to 17 Fortune 500 companies. Now, I want to give maybe an asterisk on that. I think that is our, well, I shouldn't question the preparation of this slide. I don't know if that includes Solventum or if that is with the addition of Solventum, which we expect to be the case, but the Fortune 500 list for the year I don't believe is out yet. In any case, we believe that with Solventum announcing its expansion here in Minnesota, that will be a +1 in that category. So whether it's 17 or 18, I'm not entirely sure. But that is a major win, one that we're very proud of, one that was only possible thanks to some of the resources, once again, that you all provided as a committee and as a legislature and with leadership from the governor, and the company said as much in their announcement. So we're excited about that. If we look at small businesses, not just on the Fortune 500 level, but small businesses, we're doing very well with business applications soaring. This is where the chart comes in on the right-hand side with all that purple in the upper Midwest, the change in new business applications. Purple is good, and you can see we're doing well there. Likewise, not just in starts, but in survival of small businesses, Minnesota ranks very well. In some years, we've been absolutely #1 on this rolling 5-year average. The most recent figure has us at 10th, which is still a good number. Businesses continue to expand here. We tracked 113 expansions in 2024, $12 billion in outside investment, and creating a large number of jobs. And that's also what was kind of coming to mind as you were having the conversation, especially over here, senators, about are we attracting businesses? Are we supporting business expansions? We certainly are. This might be an appropriate place for me just to mention, we did a press release on December 19th, so just a few weeks ago, about, I think it was our quarterly release indicating what businesses we've been able to assist with expansions through MIF and JCF, those tools that you all know so well and have shaped. Examples included a $15 million total project that will be done by Helene, so solar manufacturer, in Rogers, States Manufacturing, with a total investment of $23 million. Now, our piece of this is always a much smaller portion. Philips Image Guided Therapy, $31 million. And then we had Sofidel recently, who the governor honored at the Governor's International Trade Awards. And all told, I think in 2024, $1.5 billion in outside investment leveraged, 2,000 jobs created. And then I had the pleasure of giving a talk recently to the Economic Development Administration of Minnesota, Association of Minnesota. And there I noted that we are already on track in the first half of 2025 fiscal year to blow through that 2,000 job figure of 2024. In just 6 months, we've hit 1,800, so nearly the same figure as we had in all of last year. So on balance, on a macro level, the job creation engine is running well in Minnesota. We do, of course, have some storm clouds on the horizon, some question marks about how things will play out, But at the moment, it's a strong situation, and as the final bullet says, our job is to keep it going to the best of our ability with your partnership. The main focus of the time that I've been in this chair and at the agency has been on implementing the historic investments provided in the 2023 budget for the 24 and 25 fiscal years that we're in. So with $1.8 billion in total funding, that's been a big task for all of us to take on. Effective and efficient implementation has been our highest priority, and we have been doing our best to deliver on those programs, hence our tagline of DEED delivers, and that is what's on the transition slides between the portfolios of each of my colleagues who are here. So with that, over to Devin. If I may, Mr. Chairman, pass it to my colleague.
Yep. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Draheim. Thank you, Chair Champion, and members of the committee. My name is Devin Bowdry. I'm Government Relations Director here at DEED, filling in for Deputy Commissioner McKinnon. We don't look too much alike, so let's stop there. I'll let the awards and the amounts that we've distributed over the last year and a half speak for themselves, and I'll just do a speed run, 30,000-foot view of each of these programs here. So first is the Job Creation Fund, one of the programs Commissioner Verilek just mentioned. This program provides financial incentives for businesses who make real property investments and capital investments and also meet job creation benchmarks. Next is the Minnesota Investment Fund, one of the key financing tools behind Solventum that Commissioner just mentioned. This money we grant to local units of government who then provide loans, typically for business expansions. Next is the Emerging Entrepreneur Loan Program. This program, another long-standing tool at DEED, provides loans anywhere from $5,000 to $150,000 to small businesses and expanding businesses, particularly owned by people of color, women, veterans, and people with disabilities. Next is the Minnesota Angel Tax Credit, which is a 25% tax credit up to $125,000, or double that if you're filing jointly. And that funding is particularly geared toward our tech startups, more innovative programs, those creating new proprietary technologies. Next is Launch Minnesota, another tool that we have that's geared toward our innovation economy, innovative startups. These grants here are our innovation grants, so smaller grants of up to $35,000 to provide businesses with working capital, business expense funding. Next is the State Small Business Credit Initiative. This one is not a state-funded program. This is part of the $97 million that we were awarded by the feds through the American Rescue Plan Act. And so far, we have received not the entire $97 million, but just the first pot of funding, which is about 25 or so million. And then as we spend down those dollars, we then receive the future distributions. And the State Small Business Credit Initiative is listed as one program here, but it is 6 programs that we've created, and I can follow up with a list of what those are afterwards. Next is job training programs, and this is a few programs where businesses and education institutions and nonprofits partner to do job training specific for businesses and helping to keep and retain workers, keep them attached to their employer. Next is Brownfields and Redevelopment, a great program that we've had for a long time. It helps bring blighted residential, commercial, industrial locations up to a good standard, helps increase the tax base, and I believe over the life of the program has helped leverage around $3 billion. So a very successful program that we've had here. And lastly on this slide is the Energy Transition Grant Program. This is to help communities who are phasing out their coal and fossil fuel plants. These are planning dollars effectively to help them strategize how to make up that missing tax base, what to do with the labor force that will be displaced or losing their jobs or needing to transition out of these closing plants. So a lot of different grants going out across the state there. Next is the Minnesota Forward Fund, so a significant investment here particularly to leverage federal dollars through the CHIPS Act. And I just want to, they came in 3 buckets, so 50 million to do matching funds, 100 million for Department of Defense matching funds, particularly working with a couple companies there, and 250 million in CHIPS matching funds. And I just want to say it is not on this slide, but we've awarded somewhere around 124 million, but the total scope of investment also includes 350 million in federal matching funds, another 600 million in private investments. So a lot more yet to come with this pot of money. And I'll go into some more programs on supporting small businesses here. First, beginning with the Promise Act. So the Promise Act had both grants and loans. We've just finished the first round of the grant cycle, and round 2 is coming soon. And the Promise Act loans, working with META there to provide loans for small businesses. And a few more small business assistance programs. First, beginning with the Small Business Partnership Program, Assistance Partnership Program. This helps organizations, there's funding to nonprofits across the state that serve a range of constituencies. In particular, you may have an organization that really is good at serving a particular community, African-American community, the Hmong community. So this tailors business technical assistance to those groups. Obviously, we had many direct appropriations for organizations kind of doing the same and similar work. And $500,000 was to our network of small business development centers. Those are 9 centers we have across the state that have a regional focus and work with businesses at all stages. So whether a business has formally started or is in its early stages or looking to expand, these folks can help connect with resources statewide. Another $5 million in launch. So this is another portion of the launch program. This is to our education partners who also help provide regional services, and again, launch being targeted more toward the innovation economy. And lastly here, we have 10 million in capital to nonprofits through the Expanding Opportunity Fund. So this is money that we loan to the nonprofits to help them bolster their lending activities to small businesses, and this is statewide. And finally, childcare. We know childcare is an ongoing issue, both cost and slots. So this is DEED's tool to help increase the number of slots. So I believe half of this funding goes to Greater Minnesota, or is reserved for Greater Minnesota, but this program serves childcare centers statewide. And we have another award coming soon, I believe in February. We'll announce another $6.5 million. And lastly, it's coordinated by our Office of Child Care and Community Partnerships. They do all of our child care functioning because we know it's an economic development issue and want to keep that focus within DEED. And I will pass then to Deputy Commissioner Majors, if that's all right.
Yeah, please state your name for the record. Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Nelson.
I have a question on this part, or do you want
Yeah, go
comments
ahead.
at the end?
No, please, if you have a
Oh.
question, let's tackle it.
I do. Just, thank you. This is a great report. It's important to see all these things, and I like to see the investments and growth that come with them. I think I would be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to tell us, I mean, it's pretty well known that we have a fraud problem in our state. Everybody has kind of mentioned that on all sides of the aisle. And I think it's important to get on the record what's happening in these very important DEED funds that provide these great functions of growing jobs, helping people get those good jobs, being on the innovation side of our economy. And I'm just wondering if one of you might be able to speak to some of the anti-fraud provisions that are in force. We know a lot of the fraud has been not necessarily in this department, it's been in education and health and human services, but I would like you to just take this opportunity to kind of speak a little bit to the fraud issue that we have in our state.
If I could, Commissioner, I know you guys have a slide at the end on fraud. Do we want to do that first and then answer the question, or do you want to just tackle both at the same time?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay, I might just give a high-level
Perfect.
overview, a little bit like we did in conversation the other day, and then I think Deputy Commissioner Rowe was going to speak to those slides specifically, and up to you whether you want him to do that now-ish or in the sequence of the...
I like it. Go ahead.
Okay,
Commissioner.
great. Well, so thank you, Senator Nelson, for the question, and to all members of the committee, I would say to you, you're absolutely right, that preventing fraud, dealing with fraud, avoiding fraud is a high priority for us, as I know it is for all agencies. I had the opportunity actually to recently rewatch, I think it was a March 2023 hearing in this room with many of you on this same topic. It was in the period, I think, Chair Champion, you were here at the table along with Temporary Commissioner McKinnon at that time, and talked through some of what we do at the agency. And Senator Pratt, I recall, as you were all debating an amendment, there were discussion about, it's great that DEED has a strong track record, but who knows if a future commissioner will also care about this and maintain some of those same processes to prevent. And I'm here to tell you that we have continued to take that very seriously. What does it look like at DEED? Well, the answer depends on which of the entities we're talking about that we work with. With such a broad portfolio at the agency, we have a different set of tools in each case, whether it is a nonprofit grantee, and it's probably a little different if they're really big or really small, if they've been around for a long time or not, or whether we're talking about a program that serves individuals, as in the case of unemployment insurance, or whether it's a program that involves for-profit businesses. And so in each of those cases, we have a different set of tools by which we seek to prevent fraud. And then, notwithstanding the fact that we are proud to have had a good track record at our agency of preventing a great deal of it, nevertheless, we don't have a 100% perfect record. And that reflects the fact that we're always trying to strike a balance between putting steps and hoops in place that would prevent these things, while also trying to deliver services quickly with high efficiency. And so we also do need to be equipped to investigate when we find out that or to work with those that do the investigations when we find out that there are even allegations of something. And then, we have to exercise our judgment if we have just a shred of fear and doubt, or if we have hard evidence that we could take to the bank, so to speak, and whether we then need to make a hard decision about what to do with a grantee. So I guess I would invite my colleagues, the deputy commissioners, to go into more detail about what checks, what paperwork, et cetera, we require in each instance. I mean, I know from the nonprofit space, having come from being a nonprofit leader, that it is things like providing your 990 that you deliver to the IRS. It's providing a project budget that says, how exactly do you intend to use the money that has nominally been allocated to you? Because if you can't provide us a project plan that aligns with the exact legislative language that you all might have written, then we can't say yes. And sometimes we get squeezed because the nonprofits then say, well, DEED is standing in the way, and we're only doing that because we want to be that good steward of taxpayer dollars.
Thank you, Commissioner. A follow-up, Senator Nelson, or should we wait till the end? And
Mr. Chair, I don't care if it's covered right now. I didn't realize it was in your packet, or later, but I do think it is important that we cover this and just make sure that we are right on top of prevention and detection of fraud. So I'll leave it up to you, Mr. Chair.
I think we've finished up the rest of the slides. There's not that many, and then we'll bring up the subject again, if that's okay.
Chair Draheim, Chair Champion, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Mark Majors. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Development. I'm here today to provide you an overview of the activities that DEED's Workforce Development Division has undertaken over the last 2 years. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the staff and the Workforce Development team at DEED, particularly our Youth Development Services team, as well as our Adult Career Pathways team and our Contracts and Fiscal team for just doing an amazing job over the last 2 years to issue grants and to get them to get the money out to our folks in the community. Next slide, please. So we got the process started off in 2023. We issued approximately 97 grants out to not-for-profit organizations throughout the state, worth approximately $145 million. Those dollars went to workforce training, which served both youth and adults, as well as capital projects. One highlight I'd love to kind of point out now, excuse me, kind of looking at some data from September 30th, 24 for the youth grants. We had approximately about 4,400 people enrolled in that program, those youth programs. About 2,500 of them were engaged in training. And the exit rate, average wage, was approximately about $22 an hour. So we're seeing great outcomes from that programming. Next slide. Before I get into these grants, and these are our grants for our, what I would call our signature programs, which are all competitive grants, which go through RFP process and before, as we issue grants, I just want to highlight one thing for you all to keep in mind. These dollars and these programs are extremely important to the state's workforce development, public workforce system. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the state has seen an incredible reduction in Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act dollars at approximately about $5 million. And we just got a projection of about $2.5 million reduction for adult dislocated worker and youth programs. To be clear about those federal program dollars, those dollars are spread across the state through our local workforce development areas, which are our partners in delivering services throughout the state. So whenever we see those kind of significant reductions, it's impacting the entire state immensely. So this is why these programs that I'm going to talk about play a pivotal role in making sure we're closing the gap so that our public workforce system can continue operating efficiently and effectively to deliver services for folks. So our Pathways to Prosperity grant, which I know a lot of you know about, which is a longstanding grant, and through this grant we provide basic skills training, certification, industry certification, as well as upskilling of individuals. Incredible grant and plays a pivotal role in moving people into our workforce. Our second grant, which is Women Economic Security Act, which is a grant that's designed to help move women into non-traditional employment, so construction and now tech and any other type of STEM-related employment opportunities. I want to highlight that this is a program where we see one of the highest average wage placement and throughout the portfolio. The average wage is approximately about $23.27. So it's a very successful program, and it's important to our portfolio. The next one is our Southeast Asian grant, which has been in the portfolio. I've been with DEED for 6 years. I'm sure it was there probably about another 3 or 4 years prior to that, but it's been a staple in the DEED portfolio over the years. It plays a very pivotal role in making sure that we're delivering services to communities where we see our Southeast Asian populations. Now, let me be very clear. Our providers provide services to anyone who walks through the door, regardless of their Southeast Asian or any other ethnic group. We know that these groups sit in these communities because they have a great connection to the community, but they do deliver services to anyone who walks through the door. Other grant, which is one that kind of comes in and out of the portfolio every other year, but is very, very important, particularly to Greater Minnesota, is the Getting to Work grant. And these dollars are used to help individuals who are in training repair or maintain their motor vehicles system so that they can get to work. Well, it helps them while they're in training, but also get to work. And so we actually, a majority of these dollars, I say probably about 90% of the dollars actually go to Greater Minnesota, where we see a greater need than in the metro area where we have a significant public transportation system. And then the Adult Support Services grants. These are grants that are, this funding is used in investment to individuals who are in training to assist them while they're in training. So to purchase books, to buy tools, other things that are going to assist them while they're in training so they can be successful while they're in training. So I think the conversation earlier with Ms. Bauer was talking about what are some of the barriers? And a lot of times some of the barriers are for folks who just having the basic tools to get through training. So these dollars assist them. Next slide, please. I want to highlight one of our newer programs, which is our Drive for Five program, which is an investment in training individuals in our high growth industries in Minnesota. Those industries are tech, healthcare, construction/trades, education, and manufacturing. We identified these high-growth industries by looking at labor market information as we kind of came out of the pandemic. I think it was noted there's probably high vacancy rates, and this is where we see the highest in the state. But we also see that these are areas where we see high growth opportunities, as well as jobs that are leading to family sustainable wage opportunities. And so we were really excited about the funding that was being used as we were able to provide training to individuals to go into these different sectors, and as well as support services. But it was something also was new in this round, which was a connection to our trade associations, as well as our chambers of commerce throughout the state of Minnesota. This allowed for increased alignment between the workforce development system and also our employers. So we're seeing more opportunities for our job seekers to enter the workforce. So we're super excited about this partnership. We continue to build our relationship with the chambers as we kind of move forward through this process. Thank you. And then I wanted to talk about the Transformative Career Pathways Program. These are dollars, and I know this conversation came up in the last testifier, which is to bring workers who have been overlooked in the employment sector, to bring them into family sustainable wage opportunities. Generally, we look at these communities which are high, where we see high unemployment, low educational attainment, low income. But where we do also see in these communities a lot of folks who are hardworking individuals and who do want to get into the workforce and want that opportunity. So these dollars are geared to help those individuals move into new opportunities, as well as those individuals who may be in low wage opportunities to upskill and move into higher family sustainable wage career pathways. And then our youth portfolio. Again, this is where we do a great deal of grants that are issued go out through our competitive bid process. Our Minnesota Youth Programs, which does an excellent job serving individuals between 14 to 24 years old who are at risk. These dollars are usually administered by our local workforce development areas, again, who play an amazing role, an important role in the delivery of services for the state's workforce system. In addition, there are dollars there for youth support services, so kind of equal to the adult support services. These dollars are there to assist our youth while they're in training, again, to purchase books, tools, and other things they need to be successful in their during their training. And then we have our Minnesota Youth Build program. This is a program that helps young people move into primarily construction-related jobs. It's serving individuals between 16 to 24. And then recently, some of those new industries have been in the tech industry. We just want to highlight some numbers for you. And this is in last year's, in 2024. We saw 609 enrollments. We saw 540 of those youth engage in training, and 485 of them received work-based learning or work experience activities during last year. And then the last program I want to highlight is our Youth at Work program. And this program that serves 14 to 24-year-olds. This is a year-round program that begins in the summer. So some of you may have seen that there is an RFP that is out right now for Youth at Work. And the reason for that is that we want to ensure that those folks, those programs are ready to go as soon as the work of the legislature is conducted, and we can ensure our youth are getting into summer youth employment as well as a year-round program. Next slide. And then finally, just want to highlight the Office of New Americans, which was codified in 2023, thanks to the legislature. I want to acknowledge the work of Assistant Commissioner Mohammed, who's done a great job. And also, I just wanted to talk about the importance of how New Americans are to our state's economy. I think it was highlighted again in Dr. Bauer's presentation, but just kind of a reminder that our New American populations play a pivotal role in filling our labor shortages, meeting our labor shortages, starting businesses, paying taxes, and they support key industries. I think that was a question asked earlier. And those key industries from Minnesota are obviously agriculture, healthcare, and manufacturing. And then over the last couple of years, the last 2 years, the Assistant Commissioner has just done an amazing job of making sure establishing the Interdepartmental Coordinating Council, having listening sessions throughout the state to understand the needs not only of our new American population, but also of our employers, and making sure that he's helping with making a connectivity between the employers and job seekers. And he's also been working with our chambers of commerce and our local workforce development areas throughout the state of Minnesota. And then he's also been working with other local partners throughout the state as well. So this office is moving very quickly and working extremely hard to make sure our new Americans are getting connected to working with other state agencies, to make sure our new Americans have access to not only job opportunities, but also employment and business development opportunities. And I will stop there, and Mr. Chair, or Mr. Chairman, and committee, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Deputy Commissioner Rowe.
Thank you. Did you have a question? Are you good? Okay. Please state your name for the record. Deputy Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just doing a little slide down to get in front of the mic. Mr. Chair, Senators, my name is Evan Rowe. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Workforce Services and Transformation. And apologies, I have a little frog in my throat today. I think it's going around.
Yeah, just get as close as you can.
Okay,
so we can
thank
all
you.
hear you. That'd be
Thank
great.
you. Sorry about that. I have a few slides, or just around at a very kind of high level, a few short summary of some programs that are in my portfolio at DEED. And there's more detail behind these. I imagine some of these concepts might want further exploration with the committee, but a brief summary for a few of them. Starting with paid leave, the program that was passed by the 2023 legislature, wanted to provide just a brief update on progress around program delivery. One really key milestone that we celebrated back in October was the launch of wage detail reporting in partnership with Minnesota's unemployment insurance system. So we are leveraging the tools and technology of the UI system to make registration simpler for over 160,000 employers across the state. They were already able to complete their initial wage detail submission for the paid leave program by completing their regular UI report for 2020 for quarter one of FY25. Obviously, we are continuing to do outreach and doing a lot of work for the employers that are not covered under unemployment insurance but are covered under the paid leave program. And we're really doing a variety of outreach efforts across the state. One really notable one last summer and into the fall was our Greater Minnesota Roadshow, where we hosted 17 in-person events with some really great partnership with the Minnesota Chamber Federation. Had fantastic turnout, over 1,200 attendees, and really, I think that was one really useful tactic. But we're continuing to do outreach with, email newsletters and further engagements across the state. We are in the process of conducting public rulemaking. The final draft rules were posted, and we received public comments late last year. And we're in the process of finalizing those rules in partnership with the Office of Administrative Hearings. And additionally, we are preparing to roll out the equivalent plan application or private plan application process this spring. Much more to go into there, but wanted to give the committee at least a few quick hits in terms of some of the progress that the team is making, and I think a lot to be excited about there.
Good. If I could, if you're done with, are you done with that slide?
Yes, I am. Thank you,
Okay,
Senator.
thank you. So on the gearing up to get going, and I know we'll probably have a whole hearing or 2 or 3 or 4 on this subject. But you're gearing up to hire a bunch of people. And can you just give us how close are you to that? Have you picked a vendor? And then we'll move on to the next slide.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. So there's as you can imagine, for a program like this, there's a variety of kind of individual contributor roles, leadership roles, vendor components that kind of tie into this. To start with your last part first, yes, we have signed a contract with a technology vendor that is providing support in terms of delivering the benefit payment system and kind of many of the program integrity elements. It's a firm called Nava PBC. They have a very strong track record of delivering similar programs around the country, and we'll be very happy to go into more detail down the line. As far as hiring goes, largely, we're in a very good position. We're in a very good position. The management of the program is really well built out at this point. I think you'll see we'll have kind of a lot more sort of individual contributor level hiring that'll proceed throughout the calendar year as we get closer to go live. For example, we don't need to staff a customer contact center at the scale that we will need on January 1, 2026 right now. So that'll ramp up as we go throughout the year. But across all the key functions of the program, we have, I would say, a really talented group of leaders that we've staffed up for the program. I'd stack them up against any folks I have seen in my career in terms of the quality and commitment that those folks have. And, we're really excited to continue in that vein.
Thank you.
Thank you. On the next slide, just a brief update on one of the key investments from the 2023 jobs bill, which was what we're calling workforce digital transformation, which was a one-time investment to modernize many of the digital tools that support workforce development initiatives all across the state. And just wanted to share a couple highlights on this front. If you go, for example, to careerforcemn.com, which is one of the state's kind of primary career resources, we made some really significant usability and user experience improvements kind of as quick hits on coming out of this program. We're also in the process of replacing MinnesotaWorks.net, which is the state's labor exchange system. And as we've been going along, making a lot of improvements to client intake systems across a variety of the workforce development and programs around the state. So I think trying to use some one-time funds to provide some significant capital improvements and user experience improvements for job seekers around the state. Next slide, please. Another investment from the 2023 jobs bill increased the funding for state services for the blind by $4 million over the biennium. One thing that's really great about this is we're able to fully draw down our federal grant allotments and help us meet increased demand for services. And just a couple highlights of kind of additional programmatic activities. The Literacy for All campaign is recorded works in Ojibwe, Dakota Hmong, and Somali, so that people with vision impairments have access to printed materials in an audible format. And one thing that we're just really proud of is that Deed's State Services for the Blind is #2 in the nation for the number of seniors with vision loss that we serve through its Older Blind and Aging Eyes programs. Some really great public-private partnerships that we have in place with hospital systems and medical providers. And that's, State Services for the Blind and Voc Rehab are all tools that can help people stay in the workforce when they might otherwise have to leave the workforce. And at a time, in line with the state demographer's presentation, these are, I think, some really key initiatives that help expand the pool and make sure that people who want to enable it to work are able to keep working. Next slide, please. Unemployment insurance. So this is a one slide, but I think there's more that we can. There's a lot more analysis and detail that we can discuss. I think it's worth noting, I just wanted to highlight a couple trends for the benefit of the committee, and I imagine there may be questions, and happy to answer any questions that come up. But wanted to root some of what we're seeing in Minnesota in terms of national trends. In terms of payments, I think it's worth noting that kind of across the country, unemployment insurance programs all around the country have been seeing a pretty significant national growth in benefit payments since 2022. Minnesota is no different in that sense. On the revenue side, though, and it's benefit payments and tax collections that are kind of the two components that make up the balance in the UI trust fund and those elements. In Minnesota, we have seen reduced growth in collections from UI taxes, and to a large extent that is due to the pandemic era experience rate freeze. Essentially, when during the pandemic, employer experience that was attributable to pandemic-related job losses is not reflected on on employer UI tax accounts. And I know I'm kind of getting into some of the jargon here, so I can kind of get out of the weeds if it would be helpful. But I just wanted to note that as a kind of a critical component there, because that has restrained UI program tax collections. and it's kind of a key factor in terms of the overall financial position of the UI Trust Fund. And then I just briefly wanted to touch on program integrity, because I know that this, and I have one more slide on that right after this, if that is helpful. But I did want to note it just to root it in the national context, that Minnesota is a top performing state on payment accuracy and anti-fraud rates. You'll see the little nice color-coded chart on the right is taken straight from the United States Department of Labor's website that denotes that Minnesota is one of a handful of states that meets USDOL standards for payment accuracy thresholds, and Minnesota has one of the lowest rates of fraud in a kind of peer-reviewed, detailed review of UI claims that that department undertakes. I can go on to the next slide, or we can stay here
If it's all right, I had a question, from our meeting the other day. I had asked about the raw data on the fraud cases and how many checks went out on average. Any data on that?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. Can you remind me which specific data?
I think the private meeting we had when we were talking about various subjects, and then we came up with this UI subject, and I mentioned that I had sat next to somebody at the dinner who told me about his story, and then his conversation with one of your team members. And you guys were going to get me some more data on that so we could flush it out a little bit.
Sure.
Just wondering, are you going to be able to get me some more data on that?
Absolutely, Senator. And I think maybe I could again speak a little bit generally, and it might also just be helpful to kind of dig in a little bit on your constituent's kind of specific item that he raised, because oftentimes this, the more we know about a specific thing, the kind of more that we can track down. I think it's worth noting that there are different formats for when people attempt to essentially defraud the program. Some of the vectors are kind of primarily electronic and in what you might consider cybercrime, right? That people create false accounts, people steal people's information, applicant information. They try to steal your login information and things like that. Those elements are generally have to be dealt with programmatically by the UI program using a variety of analytics tools, kind of really kind of electronic and data matching, and increasingly AI tool sets to kind of help with those kinds of stop fraud before it starts. Again, I would say I think overall we have a very good track record in kind of defeating bad actors in that regard. There's another vector, of course, for fraud that is people not telling us the truth, right? You are who you say you are when you apply, but you are not giving us an honest answer on the questions that happens. That will naturally take a little bit more time for us to unpack, because we do fact-finding with the employers in many cases. Sometimes sometimes it goes into the appeal system and things like that. And we have other kind of program integrity items that we do to do checks on that. That can take a bit longer, but generally speaking, I would say that our track record, kind of in comparison with other UI programs and just looking at Minnesota specifically, is strong in that regard. But would be very happy to kind of dig in much more detail on that. And again, I want to make sure that we're answering the question that kind of specifically pertains to your constituents' issue, because each individual issue can be very individual in its application.
Sure. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. We can just continue on, and we'll just follow up if it's okay with you, Commissioner, and we'll.
That'd be perfect.
Okay, thank you.
And just on our last slide, and I think I know my colleague Deputy Commissioner Majors can kind of speak to elements in terms of preventing fraud within his portfolio, but just to speak generally for the agency, right? Waste, fraud, and abuse prevention is robust and tailored for effectiveness to the various programs administered across DEED. And I think, as Commissioner Verelek was saying, we try to apply a really carefully balanced approach that seeks to timely administer funds while also protecting precious public funds, right? And there's a very long list of these kinds of things, and it's tailored to each individual use case. But these things include, in the case of grant programs, following the policies and procedures from the Minnesota Department of Administration. It involves developing and implementing specific internal controls for each of our programs. You need to have different internal control approaches for the different types of programs that one has. It includes conducting internal audits and process checks to ensure that we're following those procedures and to make sure that we are kind of maintaining constant vigilance in updating the policies and procedures that we maintain. And of course, it involves engaging with the OLA and the various federal and other state partners that audit and review our programmatic administration. And I would just note, the governor recently issued Executive Order 25-01, and that's going to add to these efforts to strengthen investigative and enforcement authority and improve oversight and increase criminal penalties across a variety of vectors. So I will leave it there.
Any questions? I think Senator Pratt. Thank you.
Your co-chair is smiling at me like he expected this. A couple of things, Mr. Chair, and first off, I want to thank Commissioner Verlick and his team. I had a small business owner that reached out to me with concerns about paid family medical leave, that we are going to be charging sole proprietors who have no employees the payroll tax for paid family medical leave, and there was, working with her attorney, it looked like that she was going to be paying into the fund but not being able to collect. And I just learned earlier today that your website's been updated, that sole proprietors with no employees will be able to collect. I'm not sure from a public policy perspective that's necessarily a good thing, but I think from a fairness standpoint that we're going to be collecting the tax, I think it at least brings us closer to where we are. So, Commissioner, I want to thank you for, and she mentioned that you specifically talked to her, and I appreciate your hands-on approach to that. Means a lot. I do want to get back to the unemployment piece a little bit. You'll recall going into COVID, we had a $1.7 billion reserve in our UI trust fund. We spent that down to about $1.5 billion debt that we owed the federal government. We paid that off. However, Mr. Chairs, since, looking at the end of year data, and I appreciate Mr. Bowdry for sending that, we have seen a 28% decrease in our UI trust fund over the last 12 months, and a 39% decrease in our trust fund over the last 2 years. A couple of things. One, I was unaware that we were seeing that kind of rundown, and I've asked for an analysis on why we're seeing that drawdown, and I appreciate the email I got this morning, kind of highlighting what was said here, that we are seeing some uptick nationally. But there's a couple of things that just strike me as odd, right? And while you said you couldn't identify the definitive reasons, you highlighted the end of COVID era programs. And I'm trying to figure that out, because here we are 4 years past COVID, right? We effectively, about this time in 2021, we had a vaccine, we were putting people back to work. We were effectively, out of the woods, so to speak, and starting to get back to normal. And, I'm curious specifically what COVID era programs have ended that would cause our UI rate to decrease. Now, I don't want to get into the experience program or the experience rating. I understand there's a piece to that, but and we held that steady because we felt like it was unfair to charge that experience rating when it was the state government that forced them to lay those people off, put them on furlough, get them on unemployment at the time because of the policy actions. So I'm curious specifically what COVID-era programs are causing us to see this spike in UI usage.
Who wants
if
to
I-
tackle it?
Mr. Chairman, if I may start, and then I would invite a more expert Deputy Commissioner to add to that. Senator, thanks so much for the question and also for your comment about your constituent. And to be honest, I'm not sure it was me that personally spoke to her, but I personally asked somebody to speak to her.
Well, she said it was Matt, so I assumed it was you.
But it might have been another good Matt at the agency. But nevertheless, we're glad that we were able to help there, and we'll have lots more questions like that to answer over time. I wonder if the pandemic era program ending that we're thinking about is a little bit the notion that there were enhanced UI benefits during the pandemic that then went away, but that I think made probably more Minnesotans aware of the existence of the program, for one thing. And I have also seen statistics, I think, that were just featured by the Minneapolis Fed with rankings of percentages of eligible UI beneficiaries who actually do rely on this safety net when they are in that pinch of a situation. And Minnesota does really well there. So it may be, in a way, that it's a program success of people who are eligible for this are using it, and more people potentially became aware of it during the pandemic than we had before. So that's my theory of what that might refer to, but maybe Deputy Commissioner Rowe could add.
Go ahead. Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Pratt. I certainly wouldn't disagree with my boss on that as a general policy, but I think it's also correct. And again, I would say it's consistent with experience that we've seen in other states, where we're coming out of the pandemic. Many states have seen kind of significant higher utilization of UI benefits than kind of the period prior to 2022. And I imagine, like most things when it comes to the economy, there's probably a multiplicity of factors, but I think that well could be one of them. And then again, and I know you don't want to necessarily go down the experience rate rabbit hole, and I guess all of which is to say, I think there's kind of many factors that kind of tie into these pieces, and kind of trying to unpack them makes a lot of sense.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner and Mr. Rowe. And it's not that I don't necessarily want to go down the experience rabbit hole, and we can do that on short time, but I also recall that when we were talking about this, Commissioner, with your predecessor, that, quite honestly, the experience rating was a fairly minor contributor to the fund balance at the time. And we had that conversation specifically. But I'm a little curious when we look on, whether it's slide 2 or slide 3, depending on how you count them, Minnesota has more jobs than ever before. We have below national unemployment rates. We have all this good news, and yet we're draining our unemployment fund. And I'm, my question, one of the questions I asked that wasn't answered was, are there any policy changes that have come through that might be impacting the, because everybody who's drawing unemployment is supposed to be seeking a job. So are there any policy changes? Are we seeing an uptick in the average claim? Are we seeing, how do we balance, more jobs than ever before, but also increased unemployment demand? I feel like I'm getting conflicting stories, and I hope we can continue the analysis and maybe within weeks and not months get a little bit better answer about what's happening. It may be a national trend, but I'm specifically interested in this because we took basically $1.5 billion in COVID funds and put it towards this towards this program to put it back on solid footing. And one, I'm surprised, and two, I think I wasn't aware until just last fall at how bad it had actually gotten. And I don't know that there was a lot of good communication from the agency to this committee on that issue and the impact that it was going to be having until it hit our small business owners. So I would like, Commissioner, the agency to continue to dig into this, maybe give us a little bit better definitive answer. And you know, I'm thinking probably before the February forecast comes out so that we can, you know, we can incorporate that into our budgeting discussions.
Thank you, Senator Pratt. And before Deputy Commissioner Rowe kind of responds to that, I would ask the Chair Champion that I think a slot of time in the near future to kind of go over the numbers a little bit and the trend line, maybe over the last 5 years or something on this, and kind of dig into it a little bit so we all understand it as a committee of UI. And if you'll ponder that, and with Commissioner's help, you know, because I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, even with the email correspondence that's gone back and forth, and I do appreciate that. And I know Senator Pratt has dug into this issue, and it's a bipartisan concern, I think. You know, it's not political, but I think we need to understand what happened, and I think in a very short time, you know, 39% in 2 years, after we did put a large investment into it. It seems to me like there's a structural problem on how we're handling it. And I think we all need to understand what happened, so if we need to make corrections, we can. So I know we're almost out of time, and I'd like to hand the gavel over to Chair Champion to wrap up. I appreciate all four of you. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Because we are out of time. And I was told to keep it on time. So, are we good? Okay, Chair Champion.
I have some questions, but I will follow up with the commissioner directly.
Yep, and I think we'll have him back, Senator Nelson, and I think we really need to, you know, obviously we have paid family medical leave. I think we need to flush some things out of that, and then I think UI isn't done either. So, yeah, Chair Champion.
So let me just say thank you again on behalf of the committee for presenting today. Thank you for the questions that came up from the committee. We asked, number one, that those questions, whether they were put forward and you gave an answer for, if you would think deeply about it, and if there's something you should embellish upon or something you should answer, we ask that you submit that to us. We will be having another discussion about UI just to make sure that we're clear as to what it is and what we need to do in order to go forward. Another thing that I'd like for you all to think about, I know that on page 2 that you talked about, but we know that labor force is still the biggest issue our state faces. We are hearing it from employers everywhere. So you also talked about attracting and retaining Minnesotans and how we get them off the side of the road. If you have more thoughts about that, please let us know, because we're going to think about how we attack and address some of these major issues, because we want Minnesota to continue to be a great place to work, live, and play. So we hope that you would think about that. And let's see, any other questions? If not, because I have the gavel right now, we want to thank, you know, Co-Chair Jerry Heim, who did a really good job as usual, and he has been talking about this, and we'll continue to work closely together. So with that being said, the committee is adjourned.